Well, I'm guessing your thought was, my parents didn't want me listening to that song growing up, and here they're playing it in church and on Easter, at least playing part of it. What's the deal? Why would you play that song on Easter? There's more people in church today than any other day of the year, and I guess you're the only ones, my guess would be, that even heard the beginning of that song, let alone any other parts of it. Why would you play that song in church on Easter? And the reason is that it expresses the thoughts that Dennis DeYoung had 30 years ago when he wrote that song, that people have had for hundreds, literally thousands of years, and that people still have today. Some of the lines in that song, we didn't get to all of them. Wash my illusions away. Wash my confusion away. Give me the strength and the courage to believe that I'll get there someday. Show me the way. You know what? Every one of us has had those feelings at some time to some degree. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian and have been one for years. There's times where life is confusing, where things don't happen the way you expect, and you pray for the strength and the courage to just get through it. And there's certainly times as non-Christians where you say a prayer in the hopes that there even is a heaven, because you don't know and you're not sure. And wherever you fall among that or between those two groups, when you cry out, show me the way, again, you're not alone. The song was written out of those thoughts and feelings. People have those thoughts and feelings today, and you know who else did hundreds, 2,000 years ago? Jesus' disciples had the exact same thoughts that are in that song. You know, today for us is a day of celebration. It's Resurrection Sunday. It's Easter. You know, and we're so thrilled because we know Jesus is risen and He's alive. But think about that first Easter Sunday. It culminated 3 days of confusion. You know, Jesus had been arrested. He'd been put on trial. He'd been beaten. He'd been put to death on a cross and laid in a tomb, and it was sealed with a rock. For Jesus' disciples, their hope of this restored kingdom, this messianic kingdom, was in shambles. Nothing had gone the way they thought, and their own lives were in danger. They were in the upper room behind a locked door, just waiting to hear the footsteps of soldiers coming to arrest them and crucify them because they were Jesus' accomplices. That's what the first Easter morning was like. And the disciples' story is an example for us. You know, they longed for someone to show them the way, and someone did. And so I want to look at this today. I want to look at the questions that are raised there, and I'll give some of them as we go, since we didn't get to see all of them. But what causes these type of feelings? What can we do about it, and what help is there? And so really our question, and you'll see it on your outline there, is where should we look to find the way? Where should we look? And to understand the emotions of Jesus' disciples that first Easter morning, we have to go back to the beginning. And by that I mean literally the beginning. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Do you ever wonder, do you ever ask, why did He do that? Why did God decide one day, I want a world, I want a universe, I want all this? Well, He created the heavens and the earth for mankind, but then that raises the question, why did He create mankind? And if you know nothing else about the Bible, you need to realize the central message of the Bible is that God wants a relationship with people. God wants a relationship with each person who's ever lived. That is the reason that He created the world. It wasn't like He wanted something nice to look at. He was bored one day. He wanted a relationship. Think about it. The God of the universe wanted to know you, wanted to spend time with you, wanted to be active and involved in your life. But we know things didn't go as God planned because of our sin. Adam and Eve, but every one of us since has sinned. We've missed the mark of what God has said to do or not to do. And God, because of His holiness, He couldn't just ignore that. God had to. It broke that relationship in that intimate way that God wanted it to be. But from the very first moment when God confronted Adam and Eve, He did so in a way that said, I'm not giving up. I still want to have this relationship. And God made a promise in the garden, in that first moment where he talked to them, that said, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to send someone to fix this. And throughout the rest of the Old Testament, the plan got clearer and clearer. When God chose a man named Abraham to become the father of a new nation, that nation, the Jews, Israel, was promised a special person, a Messiah. And that word Messiah simply means anointed one. And there were several anointed ones. Anytime a person was made king or a prophet or things like that, they would be anointed with oil. But this Messiah, this anointed one, you could think of with a capital M, a special Messiah was going to come. He would establish a supreme kingdom. And the Messiah and his kingdom became the central feature of Judaism. If two Jews got together, this subject was going to come up. Can't wait for the Messiah to come. Oh, when the Messiah comes. That's what was first and foremost in their mind. So when the first followers of Jesus began proclaiming in John chapter 9, we have found the Messiah, just think about what that caused among the people. As they've been waiting hundreds, thousands of years, and they say, we found him. He's here, right now. Soon Jesus had around him many followers, but he selected an inner circle there. Mark chapter 3, it says, Jesus appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. And the word apostle simply means one sent out. That's who they were. These were the foundation of the church. Jesus knew when I leave, they will need to be at the forefront of starting the church, starting this new covenant group of people that Jesus wanted to bring about. Well, during their 3 years with Jesus, the apostles' anticipation of the kingdom continued to grow, and for good reason. In Matthew 4, Jesus began to preach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And he went so far at one time to say in Luke 9:27, I tell you the truth, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. And so with the anticipation that created, he's the Messiah, the kingdom is coming, it's near, he was about to establish his victorious kingdom, and so it came as a huge shock when in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. You know, when Jesus said that, Peter, who was one of the leaders of that group of 12, was so taken aback that even though seconds before he said, Jesus, I believe you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Even though he had just said that, when Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, you know what Peter did? No, you're wrong. I know you're the Son of God and all, but you've got it wrong. I know what's right. Let me correct you. Yeah. But that's what was in their mind. It's what had been in their mind for hundreds of years. As difficult as the prophecy, though, of Jesus saying, I'm going to die, as difficult as that was, well, reality was even worse. On the night of his death, Jesus was together with his disciples in a spot where they regularly went to pray, the Garden of Gethsemane. A group of soldiers surrounded Jesus. He was betrayed with a kiss. When the soldiers arrested Jesus, it says in Matthew, all the disciples deserted him and fled. They were so scared that it would happen to them too. Their own lives were in danger. As a matter of fact, Mark adds a detail. It says a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, the soldiers, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. This was no time to worry about it. He was in danger. And things only got worse before they got better. Jesus was put on trial, first by the Jewish leaders, and it's interesting. They were the judge and the jury, and they called the witnesses, but they couldn't get witnesses to do what they were going to agree was done. And finally, though, one of the high priests said to Jesus, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And he says, yes, it is as you say. And with that, Jesus was found guilty of blasphemy, which in this case means claiming to be God, to be equal to God. And that was something, an offense worthy of death, unless it was true. But the Jewish leaders didn't allow for that. They were not permitted by the Romans to carry out the death penalty. They were under the conquest of Rome at the time, and Rome had two rules. You can't declare a king, and you can't put someone to death. And so they had to take Jesus to Pilate under the charge of he declared himself to be king, so he deserves for you to put him to death. Well, that's not what Pilate, the Roman leader, found out. He says in Luke 23, he has done nothing to deserve death. He should have been set free. But in Mark 15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. And things moved swiftly in that day. They carried out the sentence, the crucifixion, that day. And so he suffered the physical agony of crucifixion, which if you don't know, and often we see pictures of nails in the palms of the hands, it wasn't there. It was in the wrist because that supported that person. They could hang there on the cross. And the thing that killed a person in crucifixion was eventually getting to the point where they couldn't breathe as they hung down there. And so as long as they could push up and take a breath, they would continue living. And often that would be prolonged for literally days. And they would be hanging on the cross, and the Romans were fine with that. Not only was it a punishment for them, it was a deterrent to everyone else. Don't do what they did. That's the reason that the Roman soldiers broke the other two people being crucified, broke their legs, so they couldn't push up to get a breath, and they died very soon after. He suffered the physical agony, but then also the spiritual agony of being separated from his Father. You know, we can't understand the Trinity completely, one God, three persons, and so we don't understand, all right, what happened there on that cross. But Jesus became responsible for the sins of the world and suffered the equivalent of eternity in hell for every person who's ever lived in that time on the cross. Imagine that as much as we can. That's what happened, and that's what was going through. And then when he was dead, his body was taken down and sealed in a tomb. And so that brings us to Easter. The first Easter Sunday, specifically the disciples' state of mind on that first Sunday. You know, the first Sunday for them, it wasn't this carefree day that was marked by matching dresses. And I remember my grandma and mom and sister, every Easter there was a different set of dresses. It's just what you did on Easter. You know, and all these colorful decorations and sticky candy, that's what we think of with Easter. That wasn't on their minds. None of that was there. The members of Jesus' inner circle were huddled in the upper room, the same room where they had the Last Supper there. And again, they were afraid the soldiers are going to come and take us like they took Jesus. That was the first Easter sunrise service there. That's what was going on. And if you had looked in their bulletin that morning, should they have had one, you wouldn't have seen songs like, He is risen. You know, He arose, Christ the Lord is risen today, my Redeemer lives. All those songs that we associate with Easter, you would have been far more likely to have seen Show Me the Way, with lyrics like, wash my illusions away, wash my confusion away, give me the strength and the courage to believe, I hope that there's a heaven, someone show me the way. That's what was on their minds. That's where they were. That's the state of mind. On that first Easter, you would have seen people with the same thoughts and feelings and fears of Dennis DeYoung when he wrote that song. And people even today, and maybe even right here, things you're going through that have you asking some of these same questions and wondering some of these same things. So what's the lesson for us? What can we get from this? And again, I believe there are several parallels between some of the thoughts raised in that song and what we see about Easter that answers those questions, that gives us the answers to some of the biggest questions we ask. You know, the first issue that's raised in that song is, I hope that there's a heaven. I hope that there's a heaven. Every night I say a prayer in the hopes that there's a heaven, and the writer is saying, I don't know. I want there to be, but I don't know if there is. Well, for hundreds of years, the Jews had waited for the coming one, for the Messiah. And throughout the years, there had been several false messiahs. A person would come and, I'm the Messiah, and maybe have some group follow him for a little bit, and then things would fall apart. Usually, they'd get put down by the Romans, and so you knew, well, that can't be the Messiah. Look what happened. But then Jesus came along, and Jesus was different. Jesus did all these miracles. Things that truly were a sign from God. And that's what miracles were. It was God's way of credentialing a person. They would come and say, hey, I'm from God. Well, anyone can say that. Yeah, but let me turn water to wine. Let me walk on the water. Let me heal people. Let me raise someone from the dead. Not everyone can do that. That was God's way of saying. And one time he literally said, this is my son, at the baptism. Jesus was different than anyone else. And so if Jesus was not the one, as his death seemed to show, just like these other false messiahs, hey, I'm the Messiah, and people got excited, and then the Romans killed him, same thing just happened to Jesus. If he's not the Messiah, wow. Was someone ever coming from God? Did God know what was going on? Is there a God? There was a lot of confusion going on. Some people here might be asking the same question. Others have tried to explain away God for centuries, and maybe in your mind they've succeeded. You've seen some of the arguments throughout the years, and even today, books come out. Here's why there's no God. You're like, well, that makes sense. I can see that. Or maybe world events raise the question, where is God when all this stuff happens? Over in other parts of the world, or maybe even in our own world? A few weeks ago when there's a mass shooting, where's God? Is there a God? Circumstances maybe in your own life, closer to home, something happens in this tragedy, and like, God, how could you? God, are you? Are you there? Is there a God? Is there a heaven? And so we cry out, show me the way. And Easter does that. Easter shows us, first of all, that the Bible is true. There is a God and there is a heaven. It's generally agreed by people on both sides of the debate, people who believe in God and people who don't, that if the resurrection is true, if Jesus died and rose from the dead, if that's true, you can believe all the rest of it. I always say you'll never find Jesus' footprints on the Sea of Galilee. But if you determine Jesus rose from the dead, then you can believe he walked on the Sea of Galilee. You can believe what he said. You can believe all of it. If that happened, well, okay, did it happen? John Singleton Copley was one of the great legal minds in British history and 3 times High Chancellor of England. And he wrote this. He says, I know pretty well what evidence is. And I tell you, such evidence as that for the resurrection has never broken down yet. In other words, if you were to have a trial and take all the evidence for the resurrection and all the evidence against it, he's saying every jury who has ever sat in a courtroom would say the evidence suggests, the evidence points toward the fact Jesus rose from the dead. There is no credible alternative. History tells us Jesus lived. History tells us he died, even that he was crucified under Pilate. We have external Roman documents that tell us that. Okay, what happened? We know he died. We know he was buried. What happened? Well, what are the alternatives to the resurrection? The first one is that Jesus' enemies stole the body. Jesus' enemies stole the body. Well, if you're familiar at all with how the church started, it was all based on the fact, and Dan mentioned this, it's Paul's preaching. It wasn't just Paul's, it was everyone's preaching, starting with Peter. The very first sermon was based on the fact Jesus died and rose from the dead. Well, if you're the enemy of Jesus and the disciples, and they say, hey, Jesus rose from the dead and you've got his body, what are you going to do? Bring out his body, right? No, he didn't. Here he is. So that one makes no sense. The enemies stole his body. The disciples stole his body. That's one that comes up. And okay, I can understand that. Maybe they did. They're like, hey, let's keep this dream alive. Let's say Jesus rose from the dead. We'll hide the body. All right. That I can understand. But you realize church history, the Bible, and other church history tells us every one of the inner circle died for their faith. They were martyred. They were tortured and put to death, except John. He was just tortured. He died eventually of old age, but he was tortured along the way. Every one of them, and not a single one of them said, wait, we made it up. There's all kinds of people today who die for their faith, but they don't know firsthand it's not true. When some suicide bomber dies for Allah, he thinks the Quran was true. He wasn't there to know it's a lie. These people would have been. They would have been in on the lie. You don't think one of them would have said, wait, I made it up, let me live? Not a single one of them did. It makes no sense to say the disciples stole the body. Well, also, if Jesus never actually died, this is one of the theories, he just passed out on the cross. And so he just sort of came to, after a while, and just sort of like in the movies. The person's there, they look dead, but no, they're never dead in the movies, are they? They always come back. Well, the same thing must have happened with Jesus. Well, the problem with that is that'd come as quite a shock to the Roman soldier who stabbed Jesus in the heart. And the blood and water came out. It'd also be hard to explain, okay, how exactly did Jesus roll away the stones and overpower a group of Roman guards after, at the very least, he was at death's door? And then another thing is the transformation of the disciples. They went from cowering in the upper room, as we see, to boldly proclaiming he's alive. Well, what's the big deal if he's alive, if he just, resuscitated? That could happen to anyone. Okay, no big deal there, nothing to base a religion on. None of the other alternatives make sense. There is no credible alternative. No one has ever been able to come up with one. Here's to how to explain. No. They just want to say, oh, it didn't happen. Well, what's your explanation? Give us one. There isn't one. If that is true, if Jesus rose from the dead, then again, everything he said can be trusted. And he said things like, there is a God. There's a need for forgiveness. Here's an offer of eternal life. There's going to be a judgment, heaven and hell for eternity. When it comes to the question of whether there is a heaven, Jesus' resurrection on Easter shows the way. Well, the other issue that comes up often in that song is, wash my illusions away and wash my confusion away. Jesus' disciples had an idea of what the coming Messiah's kingdom would be like. He was going to establish this kingdom, kick out the Romans, and the Jews would be on top of the world again. It was going to be great. Well, that didn't happen. When Jesus was nailed to the cross, their ideas proved to be illusions. Not that Jesus was the Messiah, that was still correct, but their idea of what he was going to do was all an illusion. That didn't happen. And so it led to confusion. What is going to happen? The one who we thought was going to bring about this big physical change is dead. They were full of confusion. And you and I have been confused at times, haven't we? Life goes in some direction that we didn't expect. Something happens, and just my illusion of what I thought life was going to be like. Maybe we had this idea of how life was supposed to work, even or especially maybe as a follower of Christ. Well, if I just live a good life, it won't be perfect, but there'll be some limit to the things that will happen to my health and my family and my finances. All right. And when those limits get exceeded, we realize that was just an illusion to think there were limits. To think that I had that much control over life. To think that my goodness, my being a Christian meant, well, this is what will happen, or not happen there. It destroyed the illusion. And maybe you possessed a belief in God, but some tragic thing came about, and now you wonder. Maybe you still cling to a belief in God, but you're confused about his nature. Right? God, I thought you were in control. I thought you loved me. Doesn't seem like either one of those are true. For others, your belief in God may be strong, but you're facing obstacles and questions and situations, and you don't know which way to turn. The confusion is there, and perhaps you pursued some direction that you thought, yeah, this is God's will, and you just ran into a brick wall and realized, no, that wasn't it. I was so sure. This was it. This is where God was leading me. Illusions and confusions. And so whether we say the words or not, we cry out, God, show me the way. Well, Easter does that. Easter shows us that Jesus is the answer. There's a poem by Kent Stevens that says, I searched for answers, and answers brought more searching. Then I found the one who knows all the answers, and now rest in peace, having found the answer. We spend our life looking for answers to questions and problems and situations, and God is saying, trust me, trust Jesus, my son. He has the answers. You may not know them, but you can know him, and you can trust him. He's trustworthy. We may not know why he allows things to happen, but he knows. Maybe we will come to see and understand his reasons. I mean, you look back on this, why did the Messiah die an agonizing death on the cross? His disciples had no clue at the moment, did they? This is not at all what we expected. We look back and we see, Well, he had to do that to pay for sins. There was no way we could restore that relationship with God if Jesus hadn't died on the cross. It all makes sense now. We have that advantage of hindsight. We may not understand God's reason for allowing a certain thing this side of heaven. There may be things that happen in your life and you will never see any good that comes out of it. And we love the verse in Romans, all things work for good for those who love the Lord or are called according to His purpose. That's true. It doesn't say you'll know what the good is. Oh God, I could handle this if you just tell me the good. No, you can handle it anyway if you'll just trust me. Maybe we'll see the good, maybe we won't. One thing we can know, though, is the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world from a physical perspective. The only sinless man put to death on the cross. Good came out of it. There was a reason for it. There was a purpose. There was a reason God allowed it. We can see that now, and so even if we can't see it in our own situation, if the very worst thing to ever happen had a purpose, had good that came out of it, I can trust. God doesn't mean God causes everything, but He allows it. God, I can trust. You have a reason. You had a reason for allowing that. I don't know what it is, but I trust you because I can trust you. I've seen it. When our illusions are shattered and confusion abounds, Jesus' resurrection that first Easter shows us the way. And then the last thing is the strength and the courage to believe I'll get there. You know, put yourself in that upper room the first Easter morning. The disciples were wondering, would things ever be normal again? Let alone if they would experience all the glories. You know, they're expecting to be the leaders in this physical kingdom. Here they are hiding in a room, wondering if they'll even be alive in the next few days. Would things ever get back to normal? Well, the song says, give me the strength and the courage to believe that I'll get there someday. You know, I know where there is, or I've got some idea. Will I ever get there? Will I ever get through this situation that I'm in the middle now? Because I don't know if I can make it. I don't know if I can get there. I don't know if I can hold out. Does that sound familiar? Have you had times like that? Are you in a time like that? I don't know if I can get through this. Give me the strength and the courage to believe that I'll get there someday. Show me the way. Well, Easter does that. Easter shows us that Jesus provides the strength to endure. Now, what was your Easter morning like? So far today, what's it been like? I know some of you got up early and made some food and you came here and we had a great breakfast. That's a pretty nice Easter. And what are your plans for later? And we weren't sure what would be busy today, so I'm meeting my family at the Blaze Pizza Restaurant. We figured surely not everyone's going to the Blaze, right? We should be able to get 7 seats there. Hopefully. If not, we'll go across the street to the Chinese place. That's where we went last year. No one ever goes Chinese on Easter. Lots of room there. My Easter's not so bad there. But again, the disciples, John 20, were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews. That was their Easter morning. Jesus' disciples did not possess a great deal of strength and courage that first Easter. But then look at them days later. Acts chapter 2. Peter stands up and says, men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. That's pretty bold, isn't it? To the same people who had been crying out, crucify him, days before, weeks before, and then later they stood before the same leaders who had put Jesus to death, and look what they say there. Acts 5, we gave you strict orders not to teach in his name. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus from the dead, whom you had killed by hanging him on a tree. What a transformation. What strength and what courage, and where'd it come from? Look what he said there. The God of our fathers raised Jesus from the dead. The disciples realized we follow a man who died and is now alive again. Top that. What do you got going for you? That's who's on our side. And it changed them. From these terrified men in the upper room to the boldest people willing to die for their faith. That's a lot of strength and courage. Jesus' resurrection gave that to them. It got them there where they wanted to be, the place they dreamed of being. And remember, it wasn't exactly as they expected, but it was better. The kingdom wasn't what they had in mind, this physical place where they get to be the vice presidents and secretaries of state. They get to be the people who might get put to death. And they realize, wow, this is better. God's plan. Are you facing a situation right now that requires strength and courage? Have you had some setback lately that left you empty and without the strength to face the situation or face another day? Or maybe that's become the normal state of affairs. It's not like one thing I can point to. It just seems it's been that way forever. And you're like, God, show me the way. Give me the strength and the courage to believe that I'll get there. Wouldn't it be nice if you had that? If you had some help, a source of strength? Who would be the best person to provide that kind of strength? Well, I'd go with someone who's overcome death. Because you can't get much worse than death. You can't get much more serious than death. And so if someone has overcome that, I want him on my side. I want to be on his side. I want that power working in my life, and that's what the New Testament promises over and over, that we can know the power of the resurrection in our life. We can get the strength and the courage from that. Psalm 62 says, He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. I haven't got there yet where I'm never shaken, but I know that verse, and I know I can. And I know I won't be shaken to the core, that I can come back after things knock me down a little bit because of Jesus and really because of the resurrection. What it shows me and tells me and the hope it gives me. Jesus overcoming death gives us the hope that we'll get there. Now, like them, there might be different than we expect. I've had so many things that, God, I want to get there. And God says, I got no intention of getting you there. I'll get you somewhere else. It'll be better. Trust me. Might not be easier, but it'll be better. And there's one other lesson to learn from the disciples. Jesus' resurrection, that first Easter, restored their strength and courage, but it came after 3 days of being locked in a room, fearing for their lives. We face these trials, and they often go on longer than we'd like. There's times I'm sure we wish it was just 3 days. Wow, you had it easy, disciples. 3 days? They weren't even 3 full days. Part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday. I'll take that. There are times it lasts longer than we'd like to. The time we spend waiting for Jesus to appear might seem like an eternity. There's a saying, Jesus is rarely early, but he's never late. Rarely early compared to when I'd like him to be there, but he's never late. So what should I do personally? How do we take this? We always want to see, what can I do to grow from this? And here's the thing I'd say. The main idea for all of us in some form is we need someone to show us the way. That first Easter shows us where to find the direction, the strength and the foundation when we're weak. Show us the way. And Jesus answered, I am the way. I am the way and the truth and the life. So what should I do personally? How do I follow Jesus? 3 different steps depending on where you are today. The first one is I need to restore my relationship with Jesus. Receive the forgiveness that Jesus' death on the cross made possible. Once again, God created us to have a relationship. Sin breaks that relationship, and every one of us has sinned. There is not a person in this room, there's not a person in the world who can stand before God and say, listen, I've lived a good enough life for you and I to have the relationship that you intended. If we have done one thing that falls at all short of God's glory, and wow, if we've only done one thing, that relationship is broken. It's all or nothing, and we need to restore it. That's what Jesus died to make possible, and we can restore it whenever we choose to by believing that Jesus was the Son of God, died for sins and rose from the dead, by repenting, which is turning and saying, God, I'm going to live for you instead of for me, and by being baptized, being immersed in water. Maybe that's the decision you need to make today. Or maybe I need to reclaim my faith in Jesus. For some of you, you've restored that relationship and you receive forgiveness, but the relationship is not what it used to be, or maybe it's never been what it should have been. Whatever thing, something it never was alive like other people's relationships you heard about, you heard of. Wow, their relationship's so different. I want that. Today's the day to reclaim your faith in Jesus. You've got those same feelings of doubt and illusion and confusion, and you're like, Jesus, show me the way. How do I get to what you intend? And the way to do it is to determine to put Jesus first in your life. I've been trying to have that relationship without putting you first. I sort of want the world and you on the side, but I want you on the side to be everything that you should be, and it doesn't work that way. God, I want to put you first. Show me what that looks like, and I commit right now. I sign the blank sheet to do it. Or maybe it's I need to rejoice in my life with Jesus. You might be here today and you know full well Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Savior. You accept that. You're living that out. Your life shows that He is King. Well, then rejoice. How well does your life show it? How well do other people know Jesus is in your life, and it makes an awesome difference? It doesn't mean everything's perfect, but it means I can face everything that comes along. Let people see that. Show me the way. There's other people crying out, show me the way, and God saying, hey, I need you to be the one to show them. This is what living by the way, what the early church followers used to be called, this is what living by the way does. And He wants you to show someone. Use whatever's happening in your life as a witness for them. There is nothing wrong with the feelings expressed in that song. I wish so much. I challenge you. Go home. Listen to Show Me the Way. Find a place that has the lyrics. It's an awesome song in the sense of it asks questions that we all ask. If I have a problem at times with Christian music, it's that it assumes there's no trouble and no trials going through. I've even talked to some people involved in Christian music, and they're like, you definitely got to end on a happy note if you want your song played on mainstream Christian radio. That's just the image they want to give. Sometimes, at least at times in our life, it ends still with me looking for the way. And so wherever you are today, if you're here saying, God, please show me the way, it's available. The choice is now yours, and we're going to have a hymn of invitation, we call it, a hymn of decision. And so you are invited to make a decision. God, I know you can show me the way that I've been looking for in whatever sense that means for you. Now's the time to decide to take whatever step you need, and if you're not sure, come up and talk with me now or later or anytime or someone else here. Don't just, the sad thing about that song is if it ends with a person still looking for the way when the way's right in front of them. The way can be known. Let's stand and sing our hymn of decision.